In 1190, Central Asia was not a stage of empires. It was a patchwork of ambitions. From the arid reaches of the Gobi to the river valleys near Samarkand, the region was split between warlords, khanates, and city-states. None could dominate the whole. And that very fragmentation, in the hands of the right leader, was not a weakness. It was an opening. The Mongolian steppe offered no gold, no palaces, no reason to invade. But what it lacked in wealth, it offered in speed. There were no rivers to block armies, no forests to hide rebels. Only the endless horizon, where decisions traveled as fast as horses. For someone who could ride, rally, and rule, this flat expanse was a command post waiting to be claimed. Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, understood this better than anyone. His early years were brutal. Exiled, hunted, abandoned by allies, he spent more time fleeing than fighting. But that instability taught him a truth. Loyalty in the steppe had to be manufactured. He began sealing alliances not with promises, but with marriages and hostages, exchanging sisters, sons, and brothers with rival tribes. It wasn't diplomacy in the usual sense. It was insurance. A Mongol commander named Jelm once recalled how Temujin gave his own blood to revive him during battle. Loyalty, in the Mongol world, was forged in survival. That loyalty, once secured, allowed Temujin to begin something no one had managed in a century: unify the steppe under one banner. But unification was only the beginning. The true engine of Mongol expansion was the Silk Road, a massive trade artery linking China to Persia and Europe. Whoever controlled the road didn't just collect taxes, they controlled information, migration, and power. Temujin understood that military conquest without trade control was a wasted effort. So when he took cities, he spared merchants. He even offered protection to caravans, regardless of religion or origin. There was just one flaw in this expansion: walled cities. The Mongols, masters of mobility and open battle, had no native siegecraft. Cities like Samarkand, Merv, and Nishapur were fortified with thick mud walls, stone bastions, and massive gates. Against them, Mongol arrows were useless. In the early years, they often bypassed cities altogether, circling around them like water around rocks. That would change, but not yet. The tipping point came in 1218, when a Mongol trading delegation arrived in the Khwarezmian Empire. They came with letters, gifts, and good faith. The Khwarezmian governor of Otrar accused them of espionage, killed the merchants, and sent the goods to the Shah. Temujin responded not with a complaint, but with an invasion. Within 2 years, the empire that had murdered his traders ceased to exist. That moment rewrote the Mongol playbook. Insult could justify annihilation. Trade was no longer just opportunity, it was leverage. If protected, it could fund campaigns. If attacked, it could trigger total war. A single decision in Otrar set a precedent. When diplomacy failed, retaliation would be absolute. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the Mongol rise, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support this work. What does tribal fragmentation make possible for a single ambitious warlord? In Temujin's case, it created a ladder. Each tribe, each insult, each city was a rung, and he never climbed down. The Mongol bow was not just a weapon. It was a decision engine, silent, curved, and deadly at 350 meters. Unlike the short-range, iron-heavy bows of their rivals, the Mongol composite bow, made from layered wood, sinew, and horn, could be fired from horseback at a gallop. That changed everything. In a typical battle, cavalry was used to flank, not to break the enemy. The Mongols inverted this. Their horses were extensions of their aim. Each warrior carried 60 arrows, a spare horse, and orders burned into memory. Every movement, a gallop, a turn, a retreat, was part of a larger pattern. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the Mongols baited a coalition of Rus and Kipchak forces into pursuit. For 9 days, they feigned retreat, drawing the enemy across hundreds of kilometers. When the Rus were exhausted and scattered, the Mongols turned and slaughtered them. No ambush, Just exhaustion turned into execution. To coordinate these moves, the Mongols relied not on messengers, but on flags and drums. Each color and beat had meaning. In the haze of dust and hooves, this was their signal network, decentralized units, centrally commanded. It let them divide without falling apart. Temujin's General Subutai once led 4 prongs of attack across Eastern Europe, separate armies moving hundreds of miles apart, yet striking targets within hours of each other. This wasn't chaos. It was math. Distances calculated, rivers mapped, forage estimated. Pause here. How do they feed it all? They didn't carry grain. They carried herds. Sheep, goats, mares. Each warrior was a moving supply chain. Fermented mare's milk, arag, dried meat, even blood from their own horses kept them going for weeks. With every battle, they got stronger, feeding off the land, capturing horses, absorbing tactics. There's a Mongol proverb, a man on a horse is worth 10 on foot. Not just because of speed, but because one man, fed by his own herd, could outrun, outlast, and outshoot 10 men dragging wagons. A young rider named Jeeb was once cornered by a rival clan. He shot the leader's horse, surrendered, and begged to be judged not by the wound, but by the aim. Temujin spared him. That decision gave him one of his finest generals. Mobility, deception, communication, and logistics align not by chance, but by necessity. How does mobility shift the logic of empire building? For the Mongols, it meant this. Territory wasn't something you had to hold. It was something you could hit again and again until it broke itself. In 1219, the city of Neshaper fell. After a brief resistance, the gates opened. The Mongols entered. Then the killing began and didn't stop for days. By some accounts, over 100,000 were slaughtered. But this wasn't rage. It was a message. Genghis Khan's doctrine of terror was not blind destruction. It was a lever. The goal wasn't just to take cities. It was to make others surrender before the first arrow flew. And it worked. 1 month after Neshaper, the city of Herat opened its gates without a fight. No siege, no battle, just fear. What do you think about this doctrine of fear? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss. Let's pause for clarity. Why did entire cities submit without resistance? Because stories spread faster than scouts. Mongol survivors, when allowed, were often spared to run, to tell, to carry horror like a plague across borders. Entire towns changed allegiance at the rumor of hooves in the distance. And when mercy came, it too had logic. Genghis spared artisans, engineers, scribes, anyone useful. These people weren't spared out of pity. They were repurposed. Skilled workers were often relocated to other cities, sometimes across thousands of kilometers. It was a brutal kind of meritocracy. There's a case from Bokhara. A metalworker named Sadruddin was spared after the city's fall and sent to China. Not because he begged, but because he could melt copper into tools of war. His value outweighed his blood. Internally, terror wasn't just exported, it was also inverted. For the Mongols themselves, a different logic applied. Unity, clarity, purpose. The belief that Genghis was chosen by eternal heaven, Tungri, gave divine weight to conquest. This wasn't pillage. It was fulfillment. A junior commander named Kakachu once hesitated to execute captives. Genghis reprimanded him not for mercy, but for inconsistency. In the Mongol mind, cruelty was acceptable. Hesitation was not. That clarity gave Genghis something empires rarely have: control without garrisons. Fear replaced fortresses. Loyalty replaced locks. Cities governed themselves, as long as taxes flowed and rebellions died unborn. And so the Mongol terror wasn't a side effect. It was the system. What happens when fear becomes more reliable than walls? You don't need to conquer every city. You just need to make every city believe they're next. Conquering is loud. Governing is quiet. And for an empire as fast-moving as the Mongol one, silence wasn't peace, it was signal clarity. After the initial wave of destruction, Genghis Khan faced a deeper challenge: keeping the empire intact without being everywhere at once. His solution was not to slow down, but to build an invisible spine across the continent. That spine was the Yam system, a postal relay network stretching thousands of kilometers. Every 25 to 30 miles, a station. Fresh horses, fresh riders. An urgent order from Karakorum could reach the Caspian in days. In a world of dust and rumor, that was revolutionary. It turned vastness into velocity. But communication alone didn't hold cities. Faith did, or rather, the freedom of it. The Mongols didn't care what god you prayed to. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, all were tolerated, taxed, and watched. The idea was simple. Belief caused less trouble when it wasn't threatened. A Persian chronicler once noted that under Mongol rule, Jews and Muslims argued cases before Christian judges, and no one intervened. Not because the Mongols were enlightened, because it worked. Pause here. How does an empire of steppe raiders run Persian cities and Chinese provinces? The answer, they didn't try to do it alone. Mongol governors were often not Mongol at all. They appointed locals, Persians in Persia, Chinese in China, but made them answerable to Mongol oversight. That balance of local knowledge and central control kept the system efficient and loyal. Law helped too. The Yasa, Genghis's code, began as tribal custom. But over time, it became a framework, regulating trade, taxes, and even dress codes. In the steppe, reputation settled disputes. In cities, rules had to. One story from Samarkand tells of a merchant robbed by a Mongol soldier. Instead of hiding it, the merchant rode to the local Yam station, filed a report, and within a week, the soldier was executed. Justice was fast and, more importantly, visible, and trade thrived under it. By the mid-1200s, a merchant could travel from Beijing to Baghdad under a single banner. Marco Polo would later write of how Mongol roads felt safer than European highways. Not because there were no thieves, but because punishment was certain. So the empire was not just horses and arrows. It was stationed scribes, tax codes, and tolerance. The quiet architecture that made Mongol rule last longer than the thunder of its charges. What does it mean when the fastest empire also becomes the safest for merchants? It means the storm learned how to settle without losing its edge. China was not a battlefield. It was a bureaucracy. And when Kublai Khan aimed south, he wasn't just facing walls. He was facing a system built to absorb invaders. For decades, the Song dynasty had resisted Mongol pressure. Their cities were fortified, their administration deep, their culture confident. Against them, the thunder of hooves wasn't enough. Kublai understood that. Unlike his grandfather, who would circle a city and burn it, Kublai stayed. He learned. His first step was integration, not destruction. He recruited Confucian scholars, studied Chinese law, and began adopting Mandarin court rituals. It wasn't just theater. It was a message. I'm not here to end China. I'm here to rule it. But the wall still had to fall. So Kublai imported Persian engineers and Chinese defectors, men who knew how to build traction trebuchets and tunnel under foundations. In the siege of Xiangyang, 1268 to 1273, these weapons cracked walls that had stood for centuries. The city resisted for 5 years. But when it broke, the entire Yangtze line began to fold. Let's pause here. Why did a nomadic empire need gunpowder to finish the job? Because mobility, their old strength, didn't matter inside cities. To break the Song, they had to beat them at their own game, with math, stone, and fire. That came at a cost. The Mongols were never strong at sea. Their ships, built quickly and lightly, weren't suited for monsoons or naval formation. When Kublai launched his invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, storms and poor coordination led to disaster. Tens of thousands died, and the edge of Mongol expansion was blunted. And there was a deeper problem: loyalty. By placing Chinese officials in Chinese posts, Kublai gained efficiency, but also risked rebellion. Mongol nobles resented this. Chinese citizens questioned it. The bureaucracy worked, but only when fear and favor held tight. A minor officer in Hangzhou once refused to arrest a local tax rebel. When questioned, he replied, "The emperor is far, and the people are near. That gap between ruler and ruled was growing. To close it, Kublai moved the capital north to Dadu, later Beijing. It was a symbolic shift, a nomadic court settling in a walled city. It meant stability. It also meant something harder, permanence. If you stayed with us until here, you're clearly into history as much as we are. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. So the gamble was this: abandon parts of the Mongol soul, mobility, detachment, tribal hierarchy, to gain control over the richest territory on Earth. When does an empire have to abandon its roots to keep expanding? For Kublai, the answer was clear. When the wall won't move, become the wall. Victory is loud. Collapse whispers. After Kublai, the empire was still vast, from Hungary to Korea, Baghdad to Beijing. But cracks had begun to spread, not on maps, but in minds. Succession was the first fault line. Genghis had never named a clear system, only heirs. And when an empire stretches across continents, heir becomes a dangerous word. With every death, a new Khan had to be confirmed by a Kurultai, a tribal council. But gathering the generals meant leaving frontiers exposed. Delays, disputes, and backroom deals became the norm. One such crisis erupted after Monk Khan's death in 1259. His brothers, Kublai and Erik Bok, both claimed the throne. Armies loyal to each clashed in what became the First Mongol Civil War. The empire didn't break, but it bent. That bend never straightened. Culturally, the empire was drifting apart. In Persia, Mongols adopted Islam and court poetry. In Russia, they collected tribute through local princes. In China, they became emperors in silk robes. These weren't provinces anymore. They were civilizations, and the Khan started to look more like governors than brothers. Let's pause here. What happens when the legend outgrows the living? By 1300, the memory of Genghis had turned mythical. His code, his unity, his fury, all carved into stone and song. But no living Khan could match it. The name inspired fear. The successors inspired doubt. Rivalry among elites grew sharper. Generals competed not just for loot, but for legitimacy. Cities once loyal to the center now played favorites. Tribute arrived late. Orders were questioned. The empire no longer spoke with one voice. It murmured in dialects. A Mongol prince in the Chagatai Khanate once refused to attend the imperial court in Yuan, China. "Why kneel to a man who lives like a Han?" he asked. That wasn't insult. It was fracture. And the heart of the matter? Exhaustion. Even Mongol steel has limits. After decades of campaigns, roads, reforms, and rebellions, the engine was worn. Victories felt routine. Ambitions dimmed. The center no longer inspired awe. It managed expectations. So unity, once the Mongols' greatest weapon, became their heaviest burden. What happens when an empire becomes too big to believe in itself? It begins to rule out of habit, not conviction. The Mongol Empire didn't collapse in fire. It thinned. It stretched until its logic, speed, fear, unity no longer held. What began as a roar across the steppe faded into local dialects, regional courts, fractured memories. But its imprint never left. The trade routes it secured redrew the map of Eurasia. The systems it enforced, from postal networks to meritocratic administration, influenced states long after its fragments fell. Even today, the legend of Genghis Khan is a paradox: destroyer and builder, terror and order, barbarian and statesman. And maybe that's the real legacy, not what the Mongols ruled, but how they forced the world to adapt to their movement. In a static age, they were velocity. In a divided time, they were clarity. And like all storms, they passed. But they left the ground changed. Did this episode change how you see the Mongol Empire? Like, share, and comment to let us know. And don't miss our next episode, where we dive into the Battle of the Kalka River 1223, a clash that revealed the full power of the Mongol war machine.